Good morning, everybody. My name is Juliann Anesi, and this talk is about a book project that I'm currently working on women's advocacy and disability advocacy in Samoa in the Pacific Islands. This is a piece of this book manuscript that I'm sharing with you today. And so I think I'm going to start with a vignette and to sort of set the stage and kind of get you up to speed with what I'll be examining throughout this talk, and then I'll kind of go into the rest of my talk. So Mele loved to dance and interact with people. He had an older brother named Jay, who was 5 years old and already attending preschool. Mele, spelled G-E-L-E, was also eager to go to school in Samoa. Every morning, he watched as Jay got ready for school. He sat at the kitchen counter while Jay packed his pencils, eraser, and paper in his backpack, put food in his lunch pail, and left for school. One morning, Mele asked Sina, his mother, "When can I go to school like Jay?" Not knowing what to say, Sina replied, "We'll see." Yet, Sina was bothered by her son's question, but was also motivated to find an answer. In her mind, she rehashed the reasons as to why Mele could or could not go to school. She thought, he is potty trained. He can be difficult to understand when he talks, but he knows his ABCs. He looks different from other children, but he can write his name. Despite Sina's justifications as to why Mele should be in school, the reality was that schools at the time, did not allow children with disabilities, let alone someone with Down syndrome like Mele. In 1978, a group of women in Samoa, that's spelled S-A-M-O-A, an independent state in the Pacific, came together to advocate for the inclusion of students with disabilities in schools. Representing the main island Upolu, U-P-O-L-U, some of the women were parents of disabled children, disabled themselves, or were family members and allies. Their collective goal was to establish educational institutions for people with disabilities. Yet, gathering support from the community was difficult, given the popular discourse about disabled people as urukae, or broken head, or uneducatable, quote unquote, and not worthy of inclusion in schools. The stigma and shame attached to how people with disabilities were treated applied to the educational realm and to the wider Samoan community. What compelled these women to support disabled students in the 1970s? And what can we learn from this case study about the relationships between disabled people, indigenous land, and educational policies? So as I said in the beginning, this is part of a book project. And so I was really interested more at the forefront of my analysis, understanding how the women organizers and their understandings around disability, ma'i, or sickness, and education. So eventually, the founding of these two schools, which I'll talk about today, A'oha Fimamalama and Loto Tomawhai, restructured the education system in Samoa in ways that ironically continue to segregate disabled people from their non-disabled peers. And this was a finding of this project. So my project brings together the fields of disability studies, indigenous studies, and gender studies, which situates women's activism as a form of decolonization. As Linda Smith states, quote, "Decolonization is concerned with having a more critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values that inform research practices," end quote. Or as Tina, one of the women organizers, relates, quote, "Education was decolonization in Samoa, meaning that Samoan able-bodied students were encouraged to pursue higher education goals and then take on leadership roles within the government." It is a case of how indigenous women advanced the cause and visibility of the histories of people with disabilities as much as it is about the stories of Indigenous women with disabilities and their supporters. It is the women's tautua, or service, along with women with disabilities' commitment to establishing schools that benefit all students. It is this activist effort, or quote-unquote coordinated approach, as the women organizers cite, of working with local and global allies that makes this study worthy to consider when we examine inclusive pedagogies. So for today's talk, I specifically focus on Samoan women organizers in the 1970s and their acquisition of land to build the 2 schools for students with disabilities. And here it's A'amafimamalama and Lotu Taumawhai, which were 2 schools that the first school, Fiamamalama, was started for students with intellectual disabilities, and then the second school was for students with physical disabilities, and precisely because none of these students could attend public or private schools at the time. So I highlight the influence of land stewardship in the establishing of schools and in the educating of people with disabilities. I examine the women's motivations and tactics to find land for A'amafimamalama and Lotu Taumawhai. So before I start, I just wanted to get a visual image or map of where I'm talking about. So on the left here, you have a map of Samoa. So the school that I'll be focusing on will be in the main town area of Pia. It will be on the island of Upolu. And this is the independent state of Samoa. And then, so that's the map on the left with one island group. And then on the right, the lighter blue map is sort of the surround other countries and islands that are surrounding Samoa. So Samoa is here, and then you have the various Pacific islands within Oceania, and New Zealand down here, Australia to your left, and then you have Papua New Guinea here to your upper left. So in 2006, I was in Samoa for my Nana's 90th birthday celebration. Besides the birthday party, this was also a reunion for my relatives from Australia, New Zealand, and the US. The idea for this project emerged from the stories that were told in the wee hours in the morning about previous family picnics at the beach, the mending of frayed relationships, and of course, attending of church services. My Aunt Sina, who I mentioned earlier, was reminiscing about Nele, my cousin, who was no longer with us. Nele was usually the star of the show during these family gatherings. He often danced to Michael Jackson's entire album, Thriller, and then as part of the dance finale, he mooned the audience. Nele's nonverbal statement often led to an abrupt ending to the show, with the audience quickly scurrying along and trying to forget the explicit last scene in the dance performance. It was around these incidents that I remembered my pa saying, if all chicken bums look like that, I don't want to eat any more chicken. So I think I just want to pause here for a second and kind of highlight sort of the Indigenous politics and kind of around humor here that I think would be a great source of critical insight down the road, but also as a strategy for resistance and advocacy, which I also show in my work of how the women use humor. So Sina's involvement in the establishing of the schools for disabled students was one of the stories told at the party. The story intrigued me, but it was not until 2011 when I approached my aunt again about the story of establishing the school's establishment that she nonchalantly replied, "Oh yeah, that was a little something we did back then." The organizers of the schools were parents, families of disabled students, educators, women with disabilities, and their allies. Most of the women came from middle-class families, received an education outside of Samoa, and used their privileges and resources for activist work. So in this project, I used pseudonyms for the women organizers, especially because most of the women chose to remain anonymous due to personal and familial reasons. So in 2012, my aunt's permission to write about A'amafimamalama and Lotu Taumawhai schools, I launched into conducting interviews with the founding members of the 2 schools. I specifically focus on understanding the development of the schools from 1970 to 1980. Likewise, I reflect on my positionality as a member of the communities being researched and as a researcher speaking for others. As the scholar Juliann Anesi explains, understanding the politics of conducting research in your own community is, quote, fraught with personal and professional dilemmas, end quote. Because I am researching 2 educational institutions that were co-founded by my Aunt Sina and other members of my family, their relationship directly affects my role in the project, compelling me to balance the intertwined dynamics of the university, Fa Samoa or Samoan customs. So therefore, I attend carefully to any potential class, family, generational, and political biases in the collecting and interpreting of the data. By paying attention to these points, my family members helped me to locate the women organizers in Polu from 2011 to 2013. So this is where this project grew. Before I focus on the women organizers' land in schools, I want to sort of give you a backstory of the historical context by discussing the development of the colonial schools in Samoa. So herein began the rise of ableism within the education system, or the discrimination and prejudice against people with disabilities. Mostly I want to locate where the schools were established, the types of land that these schools were built on, and how these dynamics played into the women organizers' struggles to find land for schools that would serve students with disabilities. Here I think about ableism as categories inherent in the colonial schools in Samoa, an ideology and practice that assumes able bodies are the natural order of life. So I draw from disability studies scholar Nirmala Urvalis, who suggests in her analysis of disability that historical materialism be framed within the political economy of labor to account for the social production of life. Historical materialism seeks to expose the concrete material conditions that have produced these attitudes and meaning systems about disability. Furthermore, a materialist analysis suggests that by reinserting the category of disability into social history, we can better make the shift, we can better mark the shifts, the changes, and the movements that coincide with the construction and economic structures. So hence, my understandings of disability and ma'i, or sickness in Samoa, must interrogate these colonial education structures, as well as indigenous and Western medicine and religion. So the value that is attached to the land and the economic structures that reinforce such values precisely produce the attitudes and meaning systems about disability. For example, the lack of schools and land allocated for the education of disabled students are telling about the, quote, contemporary able-bodiedness, and this is a part of Robert McGruer's work, who talks about the idea that you're always able-bodied in the standards of how we talk about people. Or the type of able-bodied students that are presumed to be the default or the norm by teachers and other professionals in education. So in 1830, John Williams of the London Missionary Society, with the intention of converting Samoans to Christianity, defined and managed the first formal education system. When the German administration governed Samoa, who then at the time was called Western Samoa, from 1900 to 1914, they also agreed to leave the business of educating students to the church. At this time, seminary schools were abundant in villages, and students were trained in reading the Bible, translating the Bible to Samoan, and carrying out missionary work across the Pacific. The German government integrated the German language in the curriculum and also established 3 schools in Apia, the main town here. And one was called Lefifi, or the expatriate schools, and this was exclusively for Palangi, or white students, or so-called Afakasi, or half-caste students, Samoan students. Malifa was another school for Samoan children, as well as a boarding school for boys to learn the German language. So from 1914 to 1962, the New Zealand administration then took over Samoa and continued to educate only able-bodied students within these facilities with the implementation of New Zealand curricula. So most of the expatriate schools, again, were in Apia. And as one Samoan educator, Ma'iai, suggests, New Zealand administrators understood education as an agent of assimilation, which was also similar to the New Zealand official policies for Maori students or indigenous people in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, as a tool in the promotion of social and economic progress. So in this section, I sort of switch back to the types of land that the women sought to establish the schools. And all the lands for, at this time for these schools that I mentioned, were mostly customary land that they were, and some of it was government land. So the subject of land in indigenous communities is complex and sensitive one. Land in the Samoan language is whanua. Likewise, whanua is also the word for placenta. Thus, whanua and placenta frame and define Samoan rights and access to land, underlining the women's cultural roles, past and present, and in land matters. Here, whanua situates women in relations to land as caretakers and mothers. Land is symbolic of women's bodies and their responsibility to the collective community. Whanua is a source of life, showing the significance of women's roles in nurturing future generations. Similar to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the northeast of Turtle Island, which many areas around the western and northern parts of the Pacific Islands have traditionally been matrilineal. So for example, here I'm thinking about the Marshall Islands, where a common saying there is, these islands belong to the women. In Samoa, land boundaries, or tuaoi, and land connections and inheritance, or tofi, are recognized as village markers to national, district, and village lands. So in Samoa, there are three kinds of lands that is often used in terms of talking about stewardship and ownership. So there's freehold, there's customary, and then there's freehold, customary, and government land. So customary land is land that is part of a village, and usually the village is comprised of various family clans who lived in the village. It does not belong to one person, and the villagers and their extended clans are considered the caretakers of the land. Customary land also cannot be sold for monetary gain by anyone without the village's consent, ensuring its transference to the next generation. So a nu'u, or a village, usually consists of matais, or chiefs, fono, the council of chiefs, as well as specific roles for the men, women, young adults, and children. And according to a Samoan census in 1961, about 87% of the population in Samoa lived on customary lands. And so, I think land here is a big part of this conversation in just locating schools, but I think within the Samoan culture is also very important because there is a lands and title courts besides the Westminster type courts in Samoa, which specifically takes on the role of figuring out land titles, figuring out sort of clan ownership or clan stewardships in various villages, and entitlements to various parts of land on island, especially around customary land. So land that is freehold pertains to land in various villages throughout the island that can be sold and purchased through monetary exchange. Individuals who have economic capital, of course mostly those in professional class such as attorneys, doctors, and business owners often purchase freehold land. And so I think in the 1960s there was about 9 to 10% of freehold land in Samoa. And then lastly, there's the government land, which usually was used by government agencies, leased out to businesses or private business or private citizens. And so the building of the preschool in Lototoma Whai, one of the schools here, was located in government land. So here I have a very short video of, just to sort of give you a visual of these schools, which are still open today and still working with the disability community. So the first one will be a visual or picture of Lototoma Whai School, to kind of give you an idea of the campus, as well as Aofi Mamalama, and then the last set of photos will be pictures of the preschool, where the preschool relocated to. And I'm not sure if I mentioned, but the preschool, which was at the Protestant church, were asked to leave the Protestant church by the church because it was in the church's hallway, community hall, and so they wanted them to relocate elsewhere, and this is part of the reason why they were looking for land to move the schools to. So here is a very brief video. So mobilizing to find land to establish these schools was not simple. The women organizers used their connections to meet with government officials and local leaders in the community. In addition to their full-time jobs as nurses, mothers, and business owners, Fele and Sina continuously reached out to potential donors for the schools. As Sina related, quote, "People kind of laughed at us, of course not in our faces, but they made comments that we were vales or crazy like our kids," end quote. At the local level, the Samoan government initially did not support the organizers' effort. Instead, the women found financial support at the international level. One organization from New Zealand called IHC funded the first school, Fia Mamalama. IHC was founded in 1949 by a small group of parents of children with intellectual disabilities in Samoa who wanted equal treatment for their children from the education and health systems. Through the IHC's international partners sectors, countries in the Asia and Pacific Islands have benefited from the New Zealand aid program. And as a result, numerous communities identified children with intellectual disabilities and empowered and encouraged their families to advocate for their right to education and work to include people with disabilities in their societies. Moreover, IHC also gave grants for professional development to attend regional conferences. In terms of other specialized organizations at this time, the women organizers tried to collaborate with the Society for the Blind. And this was, by the way, one of the first NGOs, nonprofit organizations that was started in Samoa in the 1960s, and most of their funding came from the German government. And the women were hoping to create a partnership with these various organizations and centers. Unfortunately, these efforts were unsuccessful, and so the women organizers returned to searching for land to establish the schools. The most effective tactic employed by the women organizers, as Telesia termed it, was their, quote, coordinated approach, end quote, of working with local and global allies. This method was instrumental in the establishment of the schools, but also in raising awareness for their cause. Overall, Telesia and others received monies from overseas organizations that were often dispersed through the local government offices. This simple process forced the local government to pay attention to the women organizers' requests. As Tassi, an administrator for the Ministry of Education, stated, quote, "There was no money to do this, and so Funding from outside was key, end quote. Not only did the government notice the support they were receiving internationally, but also the government soon supported the services and programs for marginal communities. Lupe, one of the women organizers, related that, quote, "It twisted the government's many arms to pay attention," end quote. This saving face move by the local government to its international peers was an effective strategy. Reluctantly, the government supported the schools and slowly took measures to amend the educational policies and financially support other non-government organizations. Finally, in 1980, Olafia Malala received its first Samoan government grant for $10,000, or as Lupe called it, peanuts, compared to the budget received from the Legislative Assembly. This money supported the salaries of the staff that were seldom paid and the utility bills for the relocation of the preschool to Fele's backyard, a house in her backyard. In addition, monies from IHC in New Zealand went to the purchasing of freehold land and supporting of the school staff. Moreover, Olafia Malala purchased freehold land from Lupe's relative, one of the women organizers. And so Lototomafai ended up relocating to government land, which was in the village of Motutua, across from the local hospital. Lastly, the noteworthy part about the 3¼ acres of land for the relocation of the preschool is that it was seawater swampland. The idea that young children, future leaders of a country, were relegated to swampland or undesirable land considered of low value very much symbolizes the discursive violence of the time. As Sia, one of the women organizers, related, many of the community did not support the organizing of preschools. There was a lot of opposition at the leadership level, and people said that, quote, "That is only child-minding service or babysitting that you are doing, and there is no education in it," end quote. Still, the preschool organizers were ecstatic to get a place to relocate the school. As Telesir related, quote, "All I asked is land somewhere close to town to set up our preschool and set up our headquarters," end quote. However, the next undertaking was to raise funds to fill in the swampland. Again, the women organizers came together and worked out a plan to get the task done. For instance, the women held fundraisers and even donated their personal monies. Cece's brother, which is another organizer, used his heavy machine equipment from his company to fill in the swampland. The women organizers used familial relations to also accomplish other tasks. Here, for example, they also did bake sales as well as plays, various plays in the community. Some of the students also were involved in a vocational education program where they made furnitures, and then local businesses would buy from them. The women organizers, So here I think about the Samoan scholar Whaiwhiao or minister Latulatai's work, which often focuses on sister-brother relationships or whiangainga or va, or a space between them in Samoa. And Latai argues that brothers' obligations to support their sisters is slowly fading away with the influence of capitalism and Christianity, and emerging are more oppositional and competitive relationships. Indeed, kinships are vital in the women's organizing encounters because with tautua or service by family members and allies, the women organizers could not have accomplished these tasks. In closing, the work carried out by the women organizers reminds us of the needs for inclusive schools and spaces. It also complicates our understandings of Samoan indigenous ideas of inclusion. This is a story about prejudice, ableism, and the balancing of communal obligations and traditional rituals, which the women organizers were instrumental in transforming. The women's philosophy was mainly rooted in what one of the organizers freely referred to as, "There had to be a better way for our kids to become more productive citizens," end quote. It is significant that women with disabilities were a huge part of this organizing endeavor. As disabilities feminist scholars and advocates point out, women with disabilities, let alone indigenous women with disabilities, continue to be underrepresented in literature and research studies. The women organizer stories will hopefully extend the conversation in Samoan studies and indigenous studies, be critical of indigenizing of the indigenization of systems within our own communities that are considered neutral and nonviolent. In disability studies and gender studies, we should be more attentive to indigenous narratives coming from the global south. More importantly, we need more stories from people like Nele and Sina, stories that teach us about inclusion, access to land, and belonging in one's community. And so I return to Nele's question at the beginning of my paper, when can I go to school like Jay? Not knowing what to say, Sina replied, we'll see. Yet Sina was bothered by her son's question, but was also motivated to find an answer. Eventually, her answer, and I want to emphasize this point, came by way of collective Samoan women organizing and advocacy. With the help of families, allies, and a supportive global community, schools like A'awhia Mamalama and Roto Tomafai materialized. This is a story about daring to reimagine disabled bodies and their futures as knowledge systems, theory, and literature. Thank you.
My question is, for practitioners, what are some of the leave-away tidbits you can get them in order to make their practices more fulfilled and pay attention to what might be the needs of indigenous communities, peoples, etc.?
Thank you, Professor Roman, for that question. So in terms of, I think a great example that the women organizers illustrated in this study is that of collaboration, meaning that they could not have done any of this organizing work of just a school without the various aspects of their families, of the government, the international community. So I would suggest, you know, if you're working with a specific group, a specific, you know, for example, my work is around people with disabilities and intellectual disabilities. As we all know, disabilities is a vast continuum of various needs. I think working with groups who are already doing this kind of work and contacting them and collaborating with them is a great resource. You know, and I think in terms of schools, it's hard to also reach out to various communities, but I think collaboration is a key word that these women gave a good example of how you can negotiate various, you know, layers of what you need and who you can talk to. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very helpful.